My name is Diane Calloway. Get something to drink and get comfortable, because what I am about to tell you took me 3 years to live through, and I am going to make sure you feel every single moment of it. I am 41 years old. I live in Memphis, Tennessee, and I am the kind of woman who learned, in the hardest possible way, that grief makes you vulnerable in ways you do not fully understand until someone decides to use that vulnerability against you. My husband Thomas passed away 18 months into our marriage, suddenly and without warning, on a Thursday morning in April, when he was 44 years old and I was 38. And we had just started talking seriously about the future we were going to build together. I was in the hospital myself when he died, recovering from a surgical procedure, and I did not find out he was gone until 4 hours after it happened because the nurses had been instructed by someone not to disturb my recovery. By the time I got home from the hospital 6 days later, my mother-in-law had moved into my house. Not visiting, not helping. Moved in. Her clothes were in the guest closet. Her toiletries were in the guest bathroom. Her car was in my driveway. And when I walked through my own front door with my overnight bag and my grief and my body that was still healing from surgery, she was sitting in my living room in the chair that had been Thomas's favorite chair, drinking tea, and she looked up at me and said she hoped I did not mind, that she had thought it made more sense for her to be here during this difficult time. I want you to sit with that image for a moment before I tell you what happened next. Welcome back to the channel, where women who were pushed to the edge of everything they owned found their way back on their own terms. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, subscribe if you are new, and let me take you back to the beginning, because nothing about the day I changed. Those locks makes any sense without everything that came before it. I want to tell you about Thomas first, because he deserves to be more than a plot point in a story about what happened after he died, and because understanding who he was helps you understand both the marriage we had and the family dynamics that surrounded it. Thomas Calloway was a civil engineer who had spent 20 years designing bridge infrastructure for a regional firm in Memphis, a man of genuine patience and specific intelligence who approached every problem, professional or personal, with the same methodical care that had made him excellent at his work. He was not a flashy man. He did not fill rooms when he walked into them. He was the kind of person who was most himself in small groups and one-on-one conversations, who remembered details about people's lives that they had mentioned once in passing and asked about them months later, who made you feel, when he was talking to you, that you were the most interesting person he had encountered that day. I met him at a neighborhood association meeting when I was 36, which is not a romantic origin story by any conventional measure, and I do not care because the outcome of it was 18 months of the most genuine partnership I had ever experienced, and I would choose an unglamorous origin story and that partnership over any alternative. Thomas's mother was named Vivian Calloway, and she had been a widow herself for 11 years by the time Thomas and I married, her husband Raymond having died of a stroke when Thomas was in his early 30s. Vivian was 67 when I met her. A small, precise woman with very specific opinions about how things should be done, and a particular talent for expressing those opinions in ways that sounded like observations rather than directives. The kind of communication style that is very difficult to push back against because it never quite announces itself as something that requires pushback. She had one child, Thomas, and she had organized a significant portion of her emotional life around him, in the specific way that some widowed mothers organize themselves around an only child. A closeness that was genuine and deep and that carried, underneath its genuine warmth, a territorial quality that I think Thomas himself did not fully see because he had grown up inside it. Thomas and Vivian had a relationship that was loving in the real sense of the word, not performed love but actual sustained mutual care, and I want to be fair about that because I think it matters for understanding Vivian fully, rather than simply as a villain in my story. She had raised him alone through his teenage years after Raymond died, had worked as a bookkeeper for a local medical practice for 20 years to keep them financially stable, had been present for every significant moment of his adult life in the attentive and consistent way that genuinely devoted parents are present. Thomas loved her with the uncomplicated love of a son who had never had reason to examine the love too closely. And I think, if he had lived longer and our marriage had had more time to develop its own weight and momentum, the natural evolution of his primary loyalty from her to us would have happened gradually and without significant conflict. But we did not have longer. We had 18 months. And 18 months was not enough time to fully shift the gravitational center of a relationship that had been organizing itself around Vivian for 44 years. I want to be honest about Vivian and me during those 18 months of marriage, because I think honesty is the only foundation a story like this can be built on. We were not close, we were cordial. We made genuine efforts in each other's direction that fell slightly short of producing real warmth, and I think both of us understood, without either of us saying it directly, that we were two women who loved the same man in fundamentally different ways, and that the coexistence of those two loves required a careful navigation that neither of us had fully mastered. She had opinions about how Thomas and I kept our home, delivered in the observational style I described, that I received and did not respond to. I had boundaries around my own domestic space and my own marriage that I maintained quietly and without confrontation. We were, for 18 months, two people doing a reasonable impression of getting along that occasionally touched the edges of something real without ever quite breaking through to it. Thomas died on a Thursday morning in April. He had a cardiac event, sudden and without warning, while he was getting ready for work. He was 44 years old, and he had no history of heart problems, and he was, by every measure that routine medical care could identify, a healthy man, and then he was not. And that is the specific cruelty of the kind of loss that arrives without preparation or warning. I was not there when it happened. I was in Memphis Methodist Hospital recovering from a laparoscopic procedure I had undergone the previous Tuesday, a routine surgery, to address an issue that my doctor had described as uncomplicated and that had gone exactly as planned, leaving me in a recovery that was uncomfortable, but not serious, and that was expected to keep me in the hospital for approximately a week. I found out Thomas was gone 4 hours after it happened. The reason I did not find out immediately was something I did not fully understand until later, and when I did understand it, it became one of the details of this story that I have had the hardest time making peace with. Vivian had been notified almost immediately as Thomas's emergency contact, which was appropriate and correct. She had come to the hospital. She had handled the initial conversations with the medical staff, and she had told the nursing staff on my floor that I was not to be disturbed, that my own recovery was fragile, and that the news would be better delivered once I was stronger. The nurses, respecting what they understood to be a family decision made with my well-being in mind, had followed this instruction. I lay in my hospital bed for 4 hours, unaware, while my husband was gone, and my mother-in-law managed the information about it, as though the management of that information was hers to control. I do not know, and I have chosen to accept that I will never know, whether Vivian's decision to delay telling me was made from genuine concern for my physical recovery, or from the particular instinct of a woman who had always been the primary person in Thomas's life, asserting that primacy in the most significant moment of loss. I suspect it was both, mixed together in the complicated way that human motivations usually are, genuine care and something else underneath it that was less easy to name. What I know is the effect, which was that I spent 4 hours in a hospital bed, not knowing I had lost my husband, and that when I was finally told, the telling happened in a way that felt managed, that felt delivered rather than shared, that lacked the specific rawness of grief that is still in its first moments, rather than grief that has already had 4 hours to begin organizing itself. The days in the hospital after I was told were the longest days I have ever lived through. I could not leave. My own recovery required me to remain for the full week, and so I lay in that hospital bed and processed the loss of Thomas in a setting that was clinical and impersonal, and surrounded by the sounds and rhythms of a medical facility rather than in my own home, in the spaces that carried his presence, in the places where grief for a specific person can find the specific objects and textures and silences that allow it to be what it needs to be. Vivian visited each day. She was composed and efficient, and handled the practical arrangements that needed to be handled. The death certificate, the funeral home, the notifications to Thomas's colleagues and friends, and I was grateful for this even as I noticed, from my hospital bed, that the handling of it was very thorough and very complete, and left very little for me to participate in. The funeral was held on the 5th day of my hospital stay. I was not there. My doctor had advised against it given my recovery status. And I had agreed because I did not feel physically capable of being present in the way I would have wanted to be present, which is to say, fully, and without the distraction of managing my own physical condition. I have thought about this decision many times since, whether I should have insisted, whether being there regardless of my physical state would have been the right choice, and I have concluded that I made the best decision available to me given the circumstances, and I try not to carry the weight of it more than that conclusion allows. I was discharged from the hospital on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after Thomas died, and I drove myself home because there was no one I wanted to ask, and because the drive 20 minutes through Memphis streets I had traveled hundreds of times felt like a thing I needed to do myself. A small reclamation of ordinary independence in a life that had just been fundamentally reorganized without my participation. I pulled into my driveway and there was a car I recognized as Vivian's parked where Thomas used to park, and I sat in my own car for a moment before going inside, not thinking anything in particular, simply sitting. I walked through my front door with my overnight bag and my grief and my body that was still tender from the surgery. And Vivian was in the living room in Thomas's chair, the specific chair he had always sat in, the chair that still had the impression of how he sat in it, drinking tea from a mug I did not recognize as mine. She looked up when I came in and said she hoped I did not mind, that she had thought it would make more sense for her to be here during this difficult time, and that she had taken the liberty of bringing a few things, so she would not have to keep going back and forth. She said this pleasantly, in the observational style she had always used, as though she were reporting a sensible logistical decision rather than announcing that she had moved into my house, without asking me while I was in the hospital, recovering from surgery and unable to come home and object. I set my overnight bag down on the floor just inside the door. I looked at Vivian in Thomas's chair with the unfamiliar mug. I looked at the living room, which was the same and not the same. The way a room is not the same when someone has been in it, arranging it according to their own sense of how things should be. There was a vase of flowers on the coffee table that I had not put there. The throw pillows on the couch had been straightened in a way that was not how I kept them. A stack of sympathy cards sat on the side table, opened and apparently read, addressed to me. I said I was very tired and that I needed to rest, and I picked up my overnight bag, and I went upstairs to the bedroom Thomas and I had shared, and I closed the door, and I sat on the edge of the bed on Thomas's side, the side I had not slept on in 18 months of marriage, and I put my hand flat on the pillow and I let myself feel, for the first time since being told in that hospital room, the full and unmanaged weight of what had happened. I stayed there for a long time, and when I came back downstairs, Vivian had made dinner, and she served it with the specific efficiency of a woman who had decided, without discussion, what the shape of the household she was now managing was going to look like. She stayed for 3 weeks before I understood she did not intend to leave. Stay with me, because what Vivian did during those 3 weeks, and what I discovered when I finally started paying attention to the details I had been too deep in grief to notice, is the part of this story that changed everything. The first week, I was largely not present in any meaningful sense, which I think is the honest description of what acute grief does to a person's ability to engage with practical reality. I moved through the days, in the specific fog of someone whose nervous system is doing. It's best to process something it was not designed to process quickly. Eating the food Vivian put in front of me, sleeping in long and restless stretches, sitting in rooms without reading or watching anything, going through the motions of acknowledging the steady stream of people who came to offer condolences. Vivian managed all of it with a competence that I was, in that first week, genuinely grateful for, because the alternative was managing it myself, and I did not have the capacity. The second week, the fog began to lift slightly, not enough to feel like clarity, but enough to begin noticing things I had not noticed in the first week. I noticed that Vivian had rearranged the kitchen in ways that were different from how Thomas and I had kept it. Subtle rearrangements. The spices moved to a different cabinet, the dish towels relocated, the coffee maker repositioned on the counter. I noticed that she had gone through the sympathy cards and organized them into a pile with a system I did not understand and had not been asked about. I noticed that she answered my phone twice when it rang and I was in another room, and that when I asked her about the calls, she summarized them in a way that felt edited, the summary of someone who has decided what information is relevant rather than passing the call through completely. I noticed these things and filed them away without acting on them because I was still in the second week of grief and I did not have the energy to address anything that was not immediately urgent. The third week, I began to notice larger things. I noticed that Vivian had been through Thomas's home office, not in an obviously invasive way, but in the specific way that a room looks when someone has gone through it carefully and replaced things, almost but not quite where they were. I noticed that a file drawer that Thomas had always kept locked was not locked, and when I opened it, I found it empty in a way that required active emptying rather than simply reflecting how Thomas had kept it. I noticed that certain documents that I had been vaguely aware of existing, the house deed, the insurance policies, the investment account statements, were not in the places I had last seen them. I noticed that Vivian had begun, in the third week, to make small comments about the house, about its upkeep, about what Thomas had always preferred in terms of how it was maintained. Comments delivered in her observational style that I was beginning to understand were not observations at all, but the early installation of a framework in which her presence in my home was being normalized as a form of stewardship, rather than named for what it was. On the last day of the third week, I came downstairs at 7 a.m. to find Vivian on the phone in my kitchen, speaking in a low voice that shifted when she heard me on the stairs. I caught enough of the conversation before she adjusted her tone to understand that she was speaking to someone about the house. Not about its maintenance, but about its status, using language that included phrases like "when things are settled," and Thomas would have wanted, and the practical considerations going forward. She ended the call when I came into the kitchen and told me she had been speaking with a family friend who had offered to help with some of the estate matters. I asked her which estate matters. She said there were various things that needed to be addressed in time, and that she was simply gathering information so I would not have to be burdened with details while I was still in the early stages of grieving. I thanked her for the coffee she had already made, and I went back upstairs and I called my own attorney. My attorney's name was Karen Shields, and she had handled the legal work for my own small interior design consulting business for 4 years. A sharp and direct woman who asked precise questions and did not soften her assessments for the sake of comfort. I called her from my bedroom, with the door closed on that Thursday morning in the third week of Vivian's residence in my house, sitting on the edge of the bed with my voice low. And I told her everything. The moved documents, the emptied file drawer, the phone call I had partially overheard, the 3 weeks of gradual, efficient, pleasant encroachment that had been happening while I was too deep in grief to name it clearly. Karen listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. The specific discipline of a person who understands that the information being given to them is more useful when it is complete than when it is interrupted. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. She asked whether Thomas had left a will. I told her I believed so, but that I had not seen it and did not know where it was. She asked whether my name was on the deed to the house. I told her yes. Thomas and I had both been on the deed from the time we married, a decision we had made deliberately and early in our marriage because we had both been adults with established lives, and we had both understood the importance of clarity in those kinds of arrangements. She asked whether I had any reason to believe Vivian had legal standing to make decisions about the house or the estate. I told her I had no reason to believe she did, but that I was no longer certain what was in the documents that had been moved from Thomas's office. Karen told me she needed to see me in person and that I should come to her office that afternoon if I could manage it. She also told me, before she ended the call, to do one thing immediately. She told me to go to the county recorder's website and pull up the current deed record for my property, and to look at it carefully and call her back if anything on it looked different from what I expected. I did this while still sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling up the county recorder's website on my phone and searching for the property address. The deed that came up showed both Thomas's name and mine as joint tenants with right of survivorship, exactly as it should have been, exactly as we had arranged it. I called Karen back and told her. She said good. That was the most important thing, and that she would see me at 2:00. I want to tell you about that afternoon at Karen's office, because the conversation we had there was the one that finally shifted me from the fog of grief into something sharper and more purposeful. And I think the shift mattered for everything that followed. Karen had done her own preliminary research before I arrived, pulling the property records and doing a basic search of the probate court filings to determine whether any estate proceedings had been initiated in Thomas's name. Nothing had been filed yet, which she said was not unusual given the timeline, but which she also said meant there was a window, a period before formal probate proceedings were established, during which certain things were more fluid than they would be once the court process was underway. She asked me to tell her everything I knew about Thomas's estate planning, and I told her what I knew, which was less than I should have known, and less than I think Thomas would have wanted me to know if he had imagined, at 44 years old, that he needed to prepare me for his death. We had talked in general terms about financial planning and about the future, the way couples do when they are building a life together. But we had not had the specific and detailed conversation about wills and beneficiary designations and account structures that I now understood we should have had earlier. I knew the house was jointly owned. I knew we had a joint checking account. Beyond that, I was uncertain about the details of Thomas's individual accounts, his investment accounts, a life insurance policy I knew existed but whose terms I did not know precisely. And whatever was in that locked file drawer that was now empty, Karen told me the empty file drawer concerned her. She told me that in her experience, when documents disappeared from a deceased person's home office in the period immediately following death, the disappearance was rarely accidental. She did not use Vivian's name. She did not need to. We both understood what we were discussing. She told me that the most important things for me to do immediately were to contact Thomas's employer to inquire about any employer-sponsored life insurance or retirement accounts and their designated beneficiaries, to contact the bank where we held our joint account to understand the current status of the account and any recent activity, and to contact whatever attorney Thomas had used for his own estate planning to understand the terms of his will, if one existed. I want to tell you about what I found when I followed each of these threads, because the findings accumulated in a way that told a stories I had not been prepared for, and that required me to significantly revise my understanding of what had been happening in my house. During the 3 weeks, I had been too deep in grief to pay proper attention. Thomas's employer confirmed that he had a life insurance policy through his workplace benefits, a policy with a death benefit of $250,000. The policy had been established before our marriage and had not been updated after it. The named beneficiary was Vivian Calloway. This was not uncommon, Karen explained when I reported back to her, for policies established before a marriage that had not been updated, and it did not necessarily indicate anything deliberate on Thomas's part, simply a gap in the administrative follow-through that many people had when it came to beneficiary designations. It was painful to learn, but it was not, on its own, evidence of anything beyond ordinary human administrative oversight. The bank account was a different matter. Our joint checking account, the account where both of our salaries were deposited and from which our household expenses were paid, had had 3 withdrawals in the 6 days between Thomas's death and my discharge from the hospital, withdrawals totaling just over $14,000, made in person at a branch location with a debit card that had been in Thomas's wallet at the time of his death. I want to be precise about the timeline here because the precision matters. These withdrawals happened after Thomas died and before I came home. During the 6 days I was in the hospital. The account was joint, which meant Vivian had not done anything that was straightforwardly illegal, in the technical sense of unauthorized account access, because the withdrawals had been made with Thomas's debit card rather than any form of account authorization in her name. But Thomas was gone. The card had been in his wallet, and $14,000 had left our joint account in 3 transactions across 6 days, while I was in a hospital bed being told not to be disturbed. Karen was very quiet for a moment when I told her this on the phone. Then she asked me whether I knew where Thomas's wallet was. I told her I did not. That it had not been among his personal effects returned to me by the hospital, and that I had assumed Vivian had it as part of her management of the immediate aftermath. Karen told me to ask Vivian for the wallet and to do it that evening, casually, and without indicating why I was asking. I told her I would. I want to tell you about the 3rd thread, the estate attorney, because what I learned from that conversation was the most significant piece of everything and the one that reordered my understanding of the entire 3 weeks most completely. Thomas had used an attorney named Gerald Foster for his personal legal matters, a man I had met once at a dinner party and knew Thomas had worked with for several years before our marriage. I called Gerald Foster's office and left a message identifying myself as Thomas's wife and asking for a callback regarding his estate. Gerald called me back the following morning, and the conversation was, from its first minutes, surprising. Gerald told me that Thomas had indeed had a will, prepared approximately 3 years before our marriage, and that Thomas had contacted him shortly after our wedding to discuss updating it. The update had been discussed in a meeting and had been drafted but had not yet been executed, which is to say Thomas had not yet signed the updated version at the time of his death. This meant the operative will was the older version, the one prepared 3 years before our marriage. Gerald told me, carefully, and with the specific gentleness of a man delivering information he knows will be difficult to receive, that the older will left Thomas's personal assets, excluding the jointly held property, to his mother Vivian Calloway. I sat with this information for a long time after the call with Gerald ended. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think the honest version of this is more useful than a simpler one. What I felt was not, in that first hour, anger. What I felt was a profound and specific sadness, the particular sadness of understanding that Thomas had intended to protect me and had not gotten there in time, that the administrative gap between intending to update a will and actually signing the updated version had left me in a position he would not have chosen for me if he had understood he was running out of time to make the correction. I do not believe Thomas knew he was going to die at 44. I believe he thought he had time. Most 44-year-olds with no history of heart problems believe they have time. The tragedy of that belief, the ordinary human assumption of time that turns out to be wrong, was the thing I sat with in that first hour, and I let it be what it was without trying to convert it into something more actionable. The anger came in the second hour, not at Thomas. At the situation, at the specific and accumulating picture of what had been happening in my house while I was in the hospital. At the $14,000 withdrawn from our joint account. At the empty file drawer. At the life insurance beneficiary that had not been updated. At the will that had not been signed. At Vivian, sitting in Thomas's chair with her unfamiliar mug, telling me pleasantly that she had thought it made more sense for her to be here. Organizing my sympathy cards, answering my phone, having quiet conversations in my kitchen about when things are settled and what Thomas would have wanted. At the entire 3 weeks of it, the pleasant and efficient and thoroughly managed encroachment that had been proceeding while I was too broken to see it clearly. I went downstairs that evening and I asked Vivian, as casually as I could manage, whether she had Thomas's wallet. She told me yes, that she had taken it from the hospital with his other personal effects, and that she had been keeping it safe. She went to the guest room and came back with the wallet and handed it to me. I thanked her and went back upstairs. The debit card was not in the wallet. I noted this and said nothing and called Karen the following morning. Karen told me that the situation, while painful, was legally complicated in a specific way that I needed to understand clearly before deciding how to proceed. The life insurance beneficiary designation was valid and would be paid to Vivian regardless of anything else, because beneficiary designations on insurance policies supersede will provisions and are not subject to the same legal challenges. This was a loss of $250,000 that I needed to accept as final. The will, the older version that left Thomas's personal assets to Vivian, was the operative document for his personal estate and would govern the distribution of whatever personal assets he held individually. This was also largely final, though Gerald Foster had confirmed that the jointly held property, the house, passed to me automatically through the right of survivorship provision in our deed, and was entirely outside the will's reach. The house was mine. That was not in question. The $14,000 was a more complicated matter. The withdrawals had been made with Thomas's debit card from a joint account, which meant Vivian had not technically committed theft in the straightforward sense because she had not accessed an account she was unauthorized to access. She had used a card that belonged to a deceased person to withdraw funds from an account that was jointly held, which was a legally ambiguous situation that Karen said could potentially be pursued, but that would involve a difficult and expensive process with an uncertain outcome. Karen's advice was to document everything, to secure the account immediately by removing Vivian's access to any remaining funds, and to decide whether the $14,000 was worth the legal battle it would require to pursue, keeping in mind that the house was secure and the primary asset was protected. I made my decisions that night. All of them, clearly and without drama, sitting at the kitchen table in my own house, while Vivian slept in the guest room down the hall. I decided that I was going to reclaim my house. Not eventually, not gradually, not through a slow process of making Vivian uncomfortable enough that she left on her own timeline. I was going to do it directly, clearly, and on a specific date that I chose. I decided that I was going to give Vivian 1 week's notice, delivered in writing so there was documentation, and that at the end of that week I was going to change the locks regardless of whether she had left or not. I decided that I was not going to pursue the $14,000 through litigation, not because I had decided it was acceptable, but because Karen was right, that the cost and difficulty of the pursuit was not proportionate to the outcome, given that my primary asset was secure, and because I had decided that what I most needed was not a legal battle, but my house back and my grief returned to me to process in my own space on my own terms. I also decided, before I went to sleep that night, that I was going to call Thomas's cousin Elaine in the morning. Elaine was 52, a practical and direct woman who had been close to Thomas growing up, and who had, over the 18 months of our marriage, been one of the family members who had made genuine efforts to welcome me. She was not Vivian's advocate. She was not anyone's advocate except her own honest assessment of what was right. And I trusted that assessment in a way I trusted very few people's in that moment. Elaine came over the following afternoon while Vivian was at a doctor's appointment, and I told her everything. She listened with the specific focused attention of someone receiving information they are going to do something with, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she had wondered, and that she was sorry I was dealing with this on top of everything else. She asked what I needed from her. I told her I needed a witness to this conversation I was going to have with Vivian when she returned. Not a participant, simply a witness, someone else present in the room, so that whatever was said could not later be described differently by either party. Elaine said she would stay. Vivian came back from her appointment at 3:30. And when she walked into the living room and found both Elaine and me waiting, I watched something shift in her expression. A recalibration, the specific adjustment of a person who had expected to walk into one kind of room and has walked into another. She sat down in the chair across from the couch where Elaine and I were sitting, and I noticed that she did not sit in Thomas's chair, which told me something about her awareness of the weight of what was happening even before I said anything. I told her, directly and without preamble, that I needed her to make arrangements to leave the house by the following Friday. I told her I appreciated the help she had provided in the immediate aftermath of Thomas's death, and that I understood she was grieving her son, and that I had genuine compassion for that grief. I told her that nonetheless, the house was mine, that I needed my own space to grieve and to begin rebuilding, and that her continued presence was not something I was able to continue accommodating. I told her I had spoken with Karen Shields, and that Karen had confirmed the legal status of the property, and that there was no ambiguity about my right to ask her to leave and to enforce that request if necessary. Vivian looked at me for a long moment after I finished speaking. Then she looked at Elaine. Elaine met her gaze without expression, the specific neutrality of a witness who has committed to witnessing rather than participating. Vivian looked back at me and said she had only been trying to help, that she had thought I needed support, that Thomas would have wanted her to be here. I told her I understood she believed that. I told her I was telling her now, clearly and directly, what I needed, and what I needed was my house. She said she did not think a week was very much time. I told her I thought a week was reasonable given that she had moved in without asking, and could therefore begin making arrangements immediately. Elaine made a very small sound beside me that might have been agreement, and might have been nothing at all. Vivian left on the following Thursday, one day before my deadline, which told me something about her. She did not leave warmly. She left with the specific chill of someone who has been told a truth they do not want to acknowledge, and has chosen to interpret the telling as an attack, rather than as honest communication. She said, as she carried the last of her things to her car, that she hoped I understood what I was doing to this family. I told her I understood exactly what I was doing. I was going home. I changed the locks that same afternoon before the day was over, with a locksmith I had called that morning, and who arrived at 4 o'clock and replaced every lock in the house in 45 minutes, while I stood in my own living room and felt something returning to me that I had not realized until it began returning, how completely I had lost. My consulting business, the interior design practice I had been running for 4 years before Thomas died, had been largely on hold during the acute months of grief, and then during the months of managing the legal and practical aftermath. I returned to it seriously about 8 months after the lock change, contacting existing clients and taking on new projects, and I found that the year of working on my own house had done something useful for my professional work, had reconnected me to the specific pleasure of the work that the preceding difficult months had made harder to access. I took on a kitchen project for a client in the fall and a full home renovation consultation in the winter, and by the end of the first year, I was back to my previous level of practice and beginning slowly to think about what growth might look like. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Karen about 6 months after the lock change, because I think it captures something important about where I was in my understanding of the entire experience by that point. Karen and I had finished the remaining legal matters related to the estate. The probate had closed. The agreement with Vivian regarding the funds had been finalized, and we were having what was essentially a closing conversation about the case. Two people who had worked through something difficult together and were acknowledging that the working through was substantially complete. Karen asked me how I was doing with all of it, not in the professional sense but in the purse sense, the kind of question that a good attorney sometimes asks when the professional relationship has included enough difficulty to create a genuine human connection alongside the legal one. I told her I was doing well, honestly, with the specific honesty of someone who means it rather than someone performing okayness for another person's comfort. She asked me whether I had any regrets about how I had handled it, and I thought about this genuinely before answering. I told her I did not regret asking Vivian to leave or changing the locks or any of the decisions I had made in that period. I told her I regretted that the situation had required those decisions at all, that I was grieving my husband and simultaneously managing an encroachment into my own home and trying to understand what had happened to documents and funds while I was lying in a hospital bed, and that the energy those circumstances had required was energy I would have rather spent simply grieving. But the decisions themselves, the directness, the specific date, the written notice, the witness, the locks, I did not regret any of those. They were the right decisions made in the right order, for the right reasons, and I was at peace with them. Karen nodded and said she thought I had handled a genuinely difficult situation with more clarity and more dignity than most people managed in similar circumstances, and that she wanted me to know that. I thanked her. And I meant the thanks because Karen's precision extended to her compliments, and when she said something she meant it, and being told by a precise person that you had handled something well is worth considerably more than being told the same thing by someone who says it easily. I want to tell you where things stand now. Because I believe in honest endings and because the honest version of where things stand is both more complicated and more hopeful than a tidy summary would suggest. It has been 14 months since I changed the locks. Vivian and I have a relationship that is carefully constructed and genuinely fragile and moving, slowly, in a direction that I believe in without being certain of. We have lunch every 6 weeks or so, at a restaurant we have both chosen to like. And the conversations are real without being complete, honest about the important things, without requiring either of us to go further than we are ready to go. She does not come to my house. I have not invited her, and she has not asked to be invited. And I think we both understand that the house is a particular kind of territory that requires more time and more trust than we have yet built before that boundary can change. We are doing what is possible. I have come to believe that doing what is possible, without requiring it to be more than it is enough. Elaine comes for dinner every few weeks. And we talk about Thomas in the easy and specific way that two people who love the same person can talk about them. When the grief has moved from its acute phase into something more integrated, something that is present and permanent, but no longer all-consuming. I tell her things about him that she did not know from the outside, specific small details from our 18 months together, and she tells me things about him from before I knew him, the camping trips and the debates about basketball teams, and the specific stubbornness he had as a teenager that had become the specific patience he had as an adult. And together we are assembling a more complete picture of the person we both miss. And the assembling of it is one of the most valuable things I have in my life right now. My house is mine. I want to say this clearly and finally, because I think it is the most important sentence in this story. Not mine in the legal sense, though it is mine in the legal sense too, jointly held with Thomas and therefore mine through the right of survivorship that we had the foresight to establish in the deed. Mine in the deeper sense, the sense in which a space becomes yours when you have filled it deliberately with evidence of who you are and how you live and what you value. The kitchen that Thomas and I talked about. The garden that is still becoming what it will be. The study painted in the blue-gray color he pointed to in a hardware store, with his drafting instruments on the wall in a frame. It is mine and it is his, and those two things are not in conflict, because the best spaces hold more than one person's presence, without any of them being crowded out. I think about the evening I came home from the hospital, the overnight bag and the grief and the body still healing from surgery. Vivian in Thomas's chair with the unfamiliar mug. I think about the 3 weeks that followed, and the things I did not notice, and the things I eventually did notice, and the conversations with Karen, and the formal letter, and the locksmith, at 4 o'clock. I think about the first evening alone in my house with the new keys in my hand, walking from room to room, moving the spices back. I think about what it means to reclaim a space that someone has occupied without your permission, the specific and unglamorous work of it, the decisions made one at a time, the locks changed before the day was over, the house returned to itself. And I think about what it means to grieve and to fight at the same time, to be in the acute and genuine pain of losing someone you loved, while simultaneously being required to protect what they left you, to be both broken and functional in the same week, the same day, sometimes the same hour. It is not heroic. It does not feel heroic from the inside. It feels exhausting and lonely and much harder than anything should be in the middle of the worst loss of your life. But it is also, I have come to understand, evidence of something. Evidence that you are more capable than grief makes you feel. Evidence that the clarity you need is available to you even when everything else is fog. Evidence that a space, a house, a life, can be taken back, piece by piece, lock by lock, room by room, if you are willing to do the unglamorous and specific work of taking it back. If someone in your life has used your pain as an opportunity, has moved into the space your grief created and begun arranging it according to their own sense of how things should be, I want you to know that you have the right to ask them to leave. You have the right to set a date. You have the right to change the locks before the day is over, and stand in the silence of your own reclaimed space and feel whatever complicated mixture of grief and relief and exhaustion and quiet satisfaction that silence produces. You do not have to be gracious about it in the moment. You do not have to soften it or manage it or perform generosity you do not feel. You simply have to do it clearly and directly and on your own timeline and then live inside the result. Tell me your story in the comments. I am here, and I read every single one. I want to tell you about the first evening after the locks were changed, because I think it matters more than any of the dramatic moments that preceded it, and because I think the quiet moments that follow the loud ones are where the real truth of a story like this actually lives. The locksmith left at 4:45, and I closed the front door behind him and stood in my own hallway with the new keys in my hand. and the house entirely empty of everyone except me, for the first time since I had come home from the hospital 3 weeks earlier. I stood there for a long moment without moving, without doing anything. Simply standing in the specific silence of a space that had been returned to you after being occupied without your permission, a silence that felt different from ordinary silence. Thicker somehow, more present, the silence of a house, recognizing that it belonged to one person again. I walked through every room, not to check anything, or to assess anything, or to look for anything Vivian might have left or taken. Simply to walk through them, to move through the spaces that Thomas and I had chosen together and filled together, and that were still and permanently ours in the way that shared spaces remain shared even after one of the people who shared them is gone. I walked through the kitchen where the spices had been rearranged, and I moved them back. Not because the rearrangement had been dramatically wrong, but because the arrangement I moved them back to was mine and Thomas's. And the restoration of it mattered to me in a way that had nothing to do with practicality. I walked through the living room, and I straightened the throw pillows, the way Thomas and I had always kept them, and I moved the vase of flowers Vivian had placed on the coffee table to the kitchen counter where I could deal with it later. I walked into Thomas's office, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before going in, because his office was the room that still carried his presence most strongly. The room where he had spent hours at his drafting table, working through bridge calculations with the focused patience that had always been one of the things I loved most about him. The file drawer was still empty. I stood in front of it for a moment, and then I closed it, and I decided, standing there in Thomas's office on the evening the locks were changed, that I was going to furnish that drawer again over time with whatever documents and records I accumulated going forward. That I was going to make it mine, the way I was going to make everything in this house mine, not by erasing Thomas from it, but by adding myself to it more completely than I had had time to do in 18 months of marriage before he was gone. I sat down that evening in Thomas's chair, the specific chair Vivian had been sitting in when I came home from the hospital, the chair that still held the impression of how Thomas sat in it, and I allowed myself to feel everything I had been managing and containing and navigating around for 3 weeks. I want to be honest about what that feeling was, because I think grief is often described in ways that make it sound like a single thing, a single overwhelming emotion that arrives and then gradually lessens, and my experience of it in that chair that evening was considerably more complicated than that description. What I felt was grief for Thomas, real and specific and centered on him as a person rather than on the situation, grief for his laugh and his patience, and the particular way he held his coffee cup in the morning, and the specific intelligence he brought to every problem he encountered. I felt anger, the anger I had been carrying since the second hour after my conversation with Gerald Foster, an anger that was clean and legitimate, and that I did not try to talk myself out of. I felt exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of 3 weeks of navigating acute loss, while simultaneously navigating someone else's encroachment into the space where that loss was supposed to be processed. And underneath all of it, I felt something that surprised me with its clarity, something that I can only describe as the specific relief of being in my own house, alone, with the new locks on the doors and the keys in my pocket, and the silence that was mine again. I called Karen the following morning and told her that Vivian had left and the locks had been changed. Karen said good, and asked how I was. I told her I was as well as could be expected, which was the honest answer. She told me there were some additional matters we needed to address when I was ready: the formal probate process for Thomas's personal estate, the account matters, the documentation of the withdrawals, and I told her I would come in the following week. She said to take the weekend and come in Monday, and I thanked her and ended the call. I want to tell you about what Karen and I addressed in the weeks that followed the lock change. Because I think the practical aftermath of a situation like this is as important to understand as the emotional aftermath, and because I think women who find themselves in similar situations deserve to know that there were things I could do even within the legal constraints I was operating in, that the situation was not as closed as it might have appeared from the outside. The probate process for Thomas's personal estate proceeded according to the terms of the older will, which meant that his individually held assets passed to Vivian. This included his individual savings account, which held approximately $38,000, his personal vehicle, and certain personal property that had been specifically enumerated in the will. I did not contest this. Karen had advised me that contesting a will requires specific legal grounds. And while the circumstances were painful, the existence of the older will and the failure to execute the updated version did not, on its own, constitute legal grounds for a contest that was likely to succeed. I accepted this as the outcome within the legal constraints that existed, and I moved forward. The $14,000 from the joint account was a matter I handled differently than I had initially decided I would. After my conversation with Karen in that first week after the lock change, I had concluded that litigation was not the right path. But Karen had suggested an alternative approach that I had not initially considered. She drafted a formal letter on my behalf, addressed to Vivian, documenting the withdrawals, the dates, the amounts, and the card used, and requesting reimbursement of the funds to the estate account within 30 days. The letter did not threaten litigation explicitly. It simply documented the facts and made the request, and it was written in the precise and formal language of legal correspondence, which carries its own implicit weight regardless of whether litigation is actually threatened. Karen told me the letter might produce nothing. She also told me that people who receive formal legal documentation of their actions sometimes respond differently than people who are simply asked informally. Vivian responded 3 weeks after receiving the letter. Not with a check, not initially, but with a phone call to Karen's office, in which she expressed, through her own attorney, whom she had apparently retained in the interim, that she was willing to discuss a resolution. The discussion that followed, conducted entirely through the attorneys, and in which I was not directly involved, produced an agreement in which Vivian paid back $11,000 of the $14,000, framed as a contribution to the estate settlement, rather than as an admission of anything. It was not everything. It was also not nothing. Karen advised me to accept it, and I did, because the alternative was a legal process that would cost more than the remaining $3,000 and consume energy I needed for other things. I want to tell you about Elaine in the aftermath, because I think her role in this story deserves more than a supporting mention, and because what she did in the months following the lock change mattered to me in ways that I am still grateful for. Elaine called me the day after Vivian left and asked how I was, and I told her honestly, and she came over that Saturday with food she had cooked herself. A practical and specific act of care that was nothing like the managed efficiency of Vivian's cooking. And everything like the genuine warmth of a person who was showing up because she wanted to, rather than because she had decided it was her role to manage the household. She came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and these Saturday visits became, over the following months, one of the anchors of my weekly life, a standing presence that asked nothing of me except to be honest about how I was doing. And that offered in return the specific companionship of someone who had loved Thomas and was willing to grieve him alongside me without agenda. Elaine also did something else, something I had not asked her to do, and that she did quietly and without announcement. She spoke to other members of the extended Calloway family, not about the details of what had happened with Vivian and the house and the accounts, but about the broader situation, about the fact that I was alone and grieving and rebuilding, and she did this in a way that shifted the family's orientation toward me in the months following Thomas's death. People called who had not called before. Thomas's uncle sent a card that was more personal than the formal sympathy cards that had arrived in the immediate aftermath. A cousin I had met twice invited me to a family gathering 3 months after the lock change, an invitation extended in a way that made clear I was being included as myself, rather than as a widow being politely accommodated. I understood that Elaine had done this, and I thanked her for once, directly, and she said she had simply told people the truth, which was that I was family and that family showed up, and that some people had needed to be reminded of that. I told her I appreciated the reminder on their behalf. She said Thomas would have done the same. I told her I knew. Vivian and I did not speak directly for 4 months after the lock change. The first contact came from her, a brief and formal note that arrived by mail, handwritten on notepaper with her name printed at the top, in which she said she hoped I was well, and that she had been thinking about me. I read the note several times, and then I put it in a drawer and thought about it for several days before deciding how I wanted to respond. I responded with a brief note of my own, equally formal, in which I said I was doing well and that I hoped she was too. And I did not reference anything that had happened, and she had not referenced it either. And the exchange existed in that specific register of 2 people who have been through something significant together and have not yet determined what, if anything, is on the other side of it. The second contact came 6 weeks after the first, another note, slightly less formal, in which she mentioned that she had found some photographs from Thomas's childhood that she thought I might want copies of and asked whether I would be open to receiving them. I wrote back and said, yes. The photographs arrived in an envelope. 2 weeks later, 12 photographs spanning Thomas's childhood and adolescence, moments I'd never seen, a birthday party when he was 7, a camping trip when he was 12, a high school graduation photograph in which he was grinning in a way that I recognized immediately as the specific grin he still had at 44 when something genuinely delighted him. I sat with those photographs for a long time when they arrived, and I put them in the album I had been slowly assembling of our own life together. And I felt, looking at the childhood photographs alongside the photographs of our 18 months, the particular fullness of understanding a person's whole arc rather than only the portion of it you were present for. I called Vivian after the photographs arrived. The call was brief and somewhat awkward, the specific awkwardness of 2 people who have a great deal of unaddressed history between them and are feeling their way toward some version of coexistence that neither of them has a clear map for. I thanked her for the photographs and told her they meant a great deal to me. She said she had thought I should have them. There was a pause, and then she said, in a voice that was different from her usual observational precision, quieter and less managed, that she knew things had not gone well between us, and that she was sorry for her part in that. She did not specify what her part had been. She did not enumerate the withdrawals or the empty file drawer or the 3 weeks in my house without asking. But she said she was sorry for her part, and the acknowledgement of a part, however imprecise, was something, and I received it as something without requiring it to be more than it was. I told her that I thought we could find a way to have some kind of relationship, that I was not interested in permanent estrangement from the mother of the man I had loved, and that I was open to figuring out what was possible between us if she was. She said she was. We did not hug through the phone. We did not make sweeping declarations. We made a modest and honest agreement to try, and we ended the call, and I sat in Thomas's chair in my living room and felt the specific, complicated weight of a situation that was not resolved, and was not going to be resolved quickly, but that had moved, fractionally and genuinely, in a direction I had not been certain was possible 3 months earlier. I want to tell you about the house, because I think the house is as much a character in this story as any of the people, and because what I did with it in the year following the lock change is the part of this story that I am most proud of, and that I want to tell you about clearly. I had bought the house with Thomas, jointly, as I told you. And it was in the specific style of an older Memphis neighborhood. A craftsman house with good bones, and a porch and rooms that had been updated at different points in its history, in ways that had not always been consistent with each other. So Thomas and I had had plans for it. Things we had talked about in the easy way of couples who assume they have time. A kitchen renovation, a back garden that we were going to develop into something more deliberate than the overgrown space it currently was, a study that we had been planning to create from a spare room on the second floor. I did all of it. Not immediately, not in the first months, when I was still in the acute phase of grief and rebuilding. But over the course of the first year, I did all of it, one project at a time, in the deliberate and patient way that I had approached everything in my professional life. I hired a contractor for the kitchen renovation in the fall, a woman who ran a small residential renovation firm, and who worked with me rather than around me, explaining every decision and every option, rather than presenting me with a finished choice. The renovation took 6 weeks, and the result was the kitchen that Thomas and I had talked about. Not exactly, because the specific conversations we had had were not detailed enough to constitute a plan, but in the spirit of them, bright and functional and genuinely good in the way that a room is good when the person who designed it understood what they needed from it. The back garden took longer. Because gardens take longer than rooms, and because I discovered in the process of developing it that I genuinely loved the work, the specific satisfaction of a space, responding to consistent attention over time, in ways that are not immediate, but that accumulate into something real. I planted things in the spring that would not be properly established for 2 or 3 seasons, and I found this deeply satisfying rather than frustrating. The understanding that some things require patience that extends beyond the current moment, that some of the best things you build are things you will not see fully until you have been tending them for a while. The study I created from the spare room on the second floor I did myself, over several weekends, with the specific pleasure of a project that is entirely within your own capability, and that requires nothing from anyone else. I painted it a color that Thomas and I had discussed, a particular shade of blue-gray that he had pointed out in a paint chip at a hardware store and said would be good in a room you wanted to think in. I furnished it with a desk and a reading chair, and the bookshelves I had been keeping books in boxes for, because we had not had enough shelf space, and I put Thomas's drafting instruments in a frame on the wall because they were beautiful objects and because they were his and because the study felt like the right place for them. I sat in that room on the first evening it was finished, in the reading chair, with a book I had been meaning to read for months, and felt something that I recognized, slowly and with some surprise, as contentment. Not happiness exactly, because grief and contentment coexist in ways that happiness does not quite allow for, but contentment, the specific satisfaction of being in a space that is entirely and deliberately yours, built for the way you actually live, rather than for any performance of how you are supposed to live.